Good evening, and welcome. Tonight I invite you to settle in beside the soft hush of northern waters, where moonlight rests on quiet waves and the air carries the faint scent of pine and salt. Tonight's story is about the Norse Vikings, not as thunder and clash, but as a long, steady breath of time unfolding beneath wide skies. As we begin, imagine a shoreline at dusk. The day's last light lingers on the horizon, pale gold fading into blue. Long wooden ships lie pulled up on the sand, their curved prows resting patiently, as if waiting for morning. Somewhere inland, smoke drifts upward from hearth fires, thin and gentle, carrying warmth into the cool evening air. This is the world of the Vikings as I will guide you through it. Not rushed, not loud, but calm and expansive. The Norse people emerged from the lands we now call Scandinavia, a region shaped by fjords, forests, and long winters. These landscapes did not shout. They whispered. They taught patience, resilience, and careful attention to the rhythms of nature. The Vikings learned to read the sky, the sea, the wind, and the slow turning of seasons. Their lives were not only voyages and raids, but fields plowed, nets mended, stories told by firelight, and children falling asleep to the crackle of wood and the murmur of voices. In the stillness of this introduction, we set aside the sharp edges of legend and step into something softer. The Vikings believed the world was alive with presence and meaning. Stones remembered footsteps. Rivers carried memory. Even silence had weight. Their myths reflected this closeness to the unseen, where gods walked quietly among humans and fate was woven thread by thread. In their stories, Odin wandered the world seeking understanding, not dominance. Wisdom was earned slowly, often through listening. Tonight, I will guide you through their lives as one continuous journey. We will drift through longhouses warmed by shared meals, across seas navigated by stars and intuition, into marketplaces filled with wool, amber, and soft-spoken trade. We will pause in moments of reflection, where a farmer looks across frost-covered ground, and a sailor listens to the sea before sleep. The Vikings were not always moving forward. Often, they were waiting, watching, and remembering. As the hours stretch gently ahead, this story will not demand your attention. It will simply offer itself, like a low tide revealing smooth stones beneath clear water. You may follow closely, or you may let the words pass through you like wind through tall grass. Both are welcome here. So let us begin, quietly and without hurry. The night is long, the path is steady, and the voices of the Norse world are ready to speak in calm tones. As we move a little further into the hush of history, allow your breath to slow, your thoughts to soften, and your mind to drift gently toward the first moments of Viking life. Part 1: The Northern World Awakens. We find ourselves at the very beginning, in the quiet northern lands where the Viking story first took shape. Imagine the early morning in the far north. The light arrives slowly here. It does not rush the horizon. It eases forward, pale and cool, touching mountain edges and drifting down into long valleys carved by ice and time. The air is clean and sharp, yet gentle. It carries the smell of wet earth, pine resin, and distant salt from the sea. This is the world that shaped the Norse people. Their homeland lies within what we now call Scandinavia, a place of contrast and patience. Summers are brief but full of life, filled with long days when the sun seems reluctant to set. Winters are slow and dark, stretching quietly across the land, teaching endurance and reflection. Between these seasons, the Norse learned balance. They learned when to act and when to wait. In a small settlement near the water, a longhouse rests against the earth as if it grew there. Its wooden walls are darkened by age and smoke. A thin line of grey rises from a roof vent, carrying the scent of burning wood into the morning sky. Inside, the fire still glows softly from the night before. The embers breathe warmth into the room, steady and calm. Life here begins early, but not hurried. A farmer steps outside, wrapping a wool cloak closer around his shoulders. Frost clings lightly to the grass, sparkling in the new light. He pauses before moving on. This moment of stillness matters. The Norse world does not reward rushing. It rewards awareness. He listens to the wind, watches the clouds, and considers the day ahead. The Vikings were deeply tied to land and sea. Though history often remembers them for voyages and conflict, most Norse people lived quiet lives rooted in farming, fishing, and craft. Their days were shaped by practical rhythms. Feeding animals, repairing tools, preparing food for months that lay ahead. Survival here required planning, cooperation, and trust in one another. Children grow up watching these routines. They learn by observing rather than being told. A young boy studies how his mother spins wool, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. A girl learns to measure grain by feel rather than number. Knowledge is passed gently, like a story repeated many times until it settles into memory. The sea lies nearby, always present. It breathes in and out along the shore, its sound steady and reassuring. For the Norse, the sea was not an enemy. It was a companion. It offered fish, travel, and connection to distant lands. Long before any journey began, shipbuilders worked patiently, shaping wood into vessels that curved like living creatures. Each plank was fitted carefully, knowing that mistakes could cost lives far from home. Even here, at the edge of land, there is calm. The Vikings believed the world was layered with meaning. Stones were not just stones. Trees were not just trees. Everything held presence. Their stories spoke of gods and spirits not as distant rulers, but as quiet influences woven into daily life. A traveler might whisper a short prayer before crossing water. A farmer might leave a small offering near a field stone. These acts were not dramatic. They were personal and familiar. Above all, the Norse understood time differently. Time was not counted only in years, but in seasons, harvests, and remembered winters. Stories were shared in the evenings when work slowed. Inside the longhouse, people gathered near the fire. Shadows danced along the walls as voices rose and fell. These were not performances. They were moments of connection. Through story, history remained alive. An elder speaks of ancestors who cleared land generations ago. Another recalls a storm that tested the strength of boats and courage alike. Each story is a thread. Together, they form a tapestry that holds the community steady. Outside, the day continues to unfold. A woman walks toward the shore carrying a basket, her steps measured. She knows the tides well. She has watched them since childhood. She waits for the right moment, then begins her work, hand steady, mind quiet. The Vikings did not separate thought from action. Work itself became a kind of meditation. This early Norse world is not loud. It is not violent by default. It is attentive. The land demands respect. The sea requires listening. Winter insists on preparation. These forces shaped a people who valued strength, yes, but also restraint. Courage, but also patience. Honor, but also responsibility. As the sun climbs higher, life continues at its steady pace. Tools scrape against wood. Footsteps press into damp soil. Smoke curls upward, blending with clouds drifting slowly across the sky. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is rushed. This is where the Viking story truly begins. Not with sails on the horizon, but with quiet mornings, shared labor, and a deep understanding of place. As we move gently onward, let the sound soften. Let the images blur just slightly, like breath against cold air. Ahead lie journeys, beliefs, and transformations. But for now, we rest here, in the calm beginning, where the Norse world awakens slowly and the day stretches wide and unhurried before us. Part 2: The World Beneath the Ash Tree. As the light of the first day settles gently into evening, we turn inward toward the Norse understanding of the world itself. When night comes to the northern lands, it does not arrive suddenly. It gathers slowly. Shadows lengthen. Colors soften. The sky deepens from pale blue to indigo, and the first stars appear one by one, quiet and watchful. Fires are tended carefully, coaxed rather than commanded. Inside the longhouse, the warmth is steady, and the outside world rests just beyond the wooden walls. This is the hour when stories are most often told. The Norse believed the world was shaped like a great living structure, held together by unseen roots and branches. At the center of everything stood a vast tree known as Yggdrasil. It was not only a symbol. It was a way of understanding existence itself. All things were connected. Nothing stood alone. The branches of this tree stretched outward into different realms, each one a place of its own rhythm and meaning. Humans lived in Midgard, a world balanced between forces greater and quieter than themselves. Above and around them lay other realms, some filled with gods, others with spirits, giants, or ancestors. These places were not distant in the way we imagine other worlds today. They were close. They pressed gently against daily life. When a Norse farmer looked at the sky, he did not see emptiness. He saw layers. He saw stories unfolding quietly above him. The gods themselves were not perfect beings. They were thoughtful, curious, and sometimes uncertain. Odin was not only a ruler but a seeker. He wandered, observed, and listened. He sacrificed comfort for understanding. Wisdom, in Norse belief, was not inherited easily. It was earned slowly, often through hardship and reflection. This view shaped how people lived. Life was understood as something temporary and precious. Fate was present, but not cruel. It was simply woven, thread by thread, by unseen hands. The Norse did not believe they could escape fate, but they believed they could meet it with dignity. How one acted mattered more than how long one lived. In the firelight, faces glow softly as an elder speaks. His voice is low and even. He tells of heroes who made difficult choices, not because they expected reward, but because honor demanded it. These stories are not meant to excite. They are meant to steady the heart. Children listen quietly, their eyes reflecting flame and shadow. They absorb these ideas before they fully understand them. Courage does not always mean fighting. Sometimes it means endurance. Sometimes it means keeping one's word through long winters and lean harvests. Outside, the wind moves through grass and trees. It carries the faint sound of water against shore. The natural world is never silent, but it is rarely loud. The Norse learned to hear meaning in subtle sounds. The creak of timber, the shift of weather, the change in bird calls. These were signs, not omens of fear, but reminders of connection. Death, too, was viewed with calm acceptance. Those who lived well were remembered. Memory itself was a kind of afterlife. Stories kept names alive long after bodies returned to the earth. Some believed that warriors who fell with honor were welcomed into Valhalla, but even this was not the center of Norse belief. More important was how one lived among others while breath still warmed the body. Daily life reflected this philosophy. Tools were cared for with patience. Meals were shared without excess. Hospitality was sacred. A traveler was offered warmth and food before questions were asked. The world was uncertain enough without turning strangers away. Kindness was a form of strength. Women and men both held responsibility within the household and community. Decisions were discussed. Disputes were settled through councils and spoken law. Words mattered deeply. A promise carried weight. Breaking one's word could follow a person longer than any wound. As the fire burns lower, someone adds another log. Sparks rise briefly, then fade. The room settles again into a comfortable hush. Outside, clouds drift slowly across the stars, veiling and revealing them in gentle rhythm. The Norse understanding of the world did not separate the practical from the spiritual. Farming and myth lived side by side. Work and belief were woven together like wool on a loom. There was no need to explain this balance. It simply was. In this way, life felt held. Even hardship fit into a larger pattern. Even loss had meaning within the wider weave of time. As the evening deepens, eyes grow heavy. The story pauses not because it ends, but because rest is needed. Tomorrow will bring its own tasks, its own listening, its own quiet choices. For now, we remain beneath the great unseen tree, branches arching gently overhead, roots reaching deep into memory and earth alike. The fire dims. Breathing slows. And as we drift softly onward, the Norse world continues to hold together, steady and patient, waiting for the next turning of the tale. Part 3. Wood, Water, and the Call of the Sea. Now the world begins to lean gently toward the water. In the Norse lands, the sea was never far away. Even when hills or forests stood between a village and the shore, the presence of water could still be felt. It lived in the air, in the weather, in the direction of the wind. It shaped decisions long before a single step was taken toward a boat. The morning near the coast arrives wrapped in mist. Low clouds rest on the water's surface, blurring the line between sea and sky. The shoreline appears and disappears in soft intervals, as if the land itself is breathing. Along the beach, wooden shapes lie quiet and patient. These are the longships, drawn up on the sand, their hulls dark with age and care. Shipbuilding among the Norse was not hurried work. It began deep in the forests, where tall trees grew slowly, shaped by wind and snow. A tree was chosen carefully. Its grain was studied. Its curve was respected. Cutting it down was not taken lightly. Wood was a gift, and it demanded skill in return. Each plank that would one day meet the sea was shaped with attention and calm hands. In a small shipyard near the water, men and women work side by side. Tools tap softly against wood. The sound is rhythmic, steady, almost soothing. No one raises their voice. Everyone understands the importance of what they are building. A longship is not only transport. It is shelter, livelihood, and lifeline. The design of these ships reflects deep understanding. They are long and narrow, flexible rather than rigid. Their shallow draft allows them to glide over rivers and approach shorelines without resistance. The curved prow cuts through water smoothly, while the overlapping planks move gently with the waves instead of fighting them. The sea is not something to conquer. It is something to travel with. When the ships are ready, they do not depart in a rush. People gather quietly along the shore. Some come to sail. Others come simply to watch. A mother adjusts her child's cloak against the morning chill. An elder rests on a walking stick, eyes thoughtful. There is no shouting. No dramatic farewell. Just nods, brief embraces, and shared understanding. The oars slip into the water. The first strokes are slow, measured. The ship responds like a living thing, rocking gently before settling into motion. As the shoreline begins to drift away, the sound of land fades. What remains is water, breath, and the steady rhythm of movement. Navigation for the Norse relied on observation rather than instruments. They watched the sun's path across the sky. They noted the color of the water and the behavior of birds. At night, they read the stars, recognizing familiar patterns that guided them across open stretches of sea. Even clouds carried meaning. Their height, speed, and shape offered clues to what lay ahead. Some stories speak of sunstones, crystals that could help locate light through cloud cover. Whether myth or practice, the idea itself reveals something important. The Norse trusted subtle signs. They believed the world offered guidance to those who paid attention. The sea itself was not feared. It was respected. It could be generous or unforgiving, but it was never random. Storms were approached with preparation, not panic. When waves grew rough, voices remained low. Each sailor knew their role. Cooperation was survival. There was no room for ego on open water. As the ship moves farther from shore, the world simplifies. Sky above. Water below. Wood beneath one's feet. The sound of oars becomes a steady lull, almost like a heartbeat. Time stretches. Minutes lose their sharp edges. The mind quiets, settling into the rhythm of travel. For many Norse people, these journeys were not about conquest. They were about connection. Trade routes linked distant communities across the North Sea and beyond. Furs, amber, wool, and crafted goods moved gently from one hand to another. Stories traveled with them. Ideas followed. The world grew larger, but also more familiar. Even when voyages carried risk, they were undertaken with purpose. To seek land. To exchange goods. To learn what lay beyond the horizon. Curiosity was a quiet but powerful force. The sea did not represent escape from home. It was an extension of it. At night aboard the ship, rest comes in brief intervals. Sailors wrap themselves in cloaks, leaning against the wooden sides. Someone hums softly, a tune without words. Above, stars reflect faintly on the water's surface, doubling the sky. The ship continues forward, steady and unhurried. In these moments, the Norse felt close to the world's deeper structure. Water connected realms just as land did. Beneath the surface, unseen currents moved with purpose. Above, constellations turned slowly, marking the passage of time. Everything was in motion, yet nothing felt rushed. Eventually, land reappears. At first, it is only a darker line against the horizon. Then shape follows. Hills. Trees. A shoreline welcoming the ship home or guiding it toward something new. The oars slow. The hull glides forward, almost eager to meet the earth again. The journey ends as quietly as it began. Feet touch sand. The ship is pulled up gently, thanked with care rather than force. People stand for a moment, stretching, breathing, looking around. There is no rush to speak. The sea still hums softly behind them. This is the Viking world at its heart. Wood shaped by patience. Water crossed through trust. Movement guided by attention rather than urgency. The sea is not a boundary, but a path. As we drift onward into the next part of the story, let the image of the longship linger. Let its steady motion calm the mind. The oars continue their rhythm somewhere in memory, carrying us gently forward into the lives shaped by law, land, and shared words that await just ahead. Part 4: Words that bound the world. Now we step away from the shoreline and into a wide open space where voices carry gently across grass and stone. The Norse world was held together not only by wood and water, but by words. On a clear day, people gather beneath the open sky. There are no walls here, no roof, no raised throne. The land itself becomes the meeting place. A low hill rises slightly from the plain. Stones mark familiar boundaries. Paths converge quietly as families arrive, one by one, greeting each other with calm recognition. This is the thing, the Norse assembly. In these gatherings, law is spoken aloud, disputes are heard, and decisions are shaped through conversation rather than force. The word itself comes from an old meaning, a place where matters are discussed. It is not hurried. It is not chaotic. It unfolds with patience. Among the most famous of these assemblies was the Althing, held in a broad, open landscape where earth and sky seemed to meet. Here, people stood shoulder to shoulder, listening as laws were recited from memory. There were no written codes at first. Law lived in voices, carried carefully from one generation to the next. At the center stands the law speaker. He does not shout. He does not command. His voice is steady and practiced, shaped by years of listening and repetition. He speaks the law as it has always been spoken, word for word, allowing its familiar rhythm to settle over the crowd. In this way, memory becomes structure, and structure becomes stability. Disputes are brought forward calmly. Two neighbors step into the open space. Their disagreement may involve land boundaries, livestock, or a broken promise. Each speaks in turn. Interruptions are rare. Listening is valued as much as speaking. Witnesses may be called. Past decisions are remembered and referenced. The goal is not victory. The goal is balance. Honor matters here, but not in the way stories often suggest. Honor is not loud or aggressive. It is measured by consistency, by fairness, by the ability to stand before others and speak truthfully. To accept judgment without resentment is seen as strength. To hold a grudge beyond resolution is considered weakness. Women attend these gatherings as well. They bring cases, offer testimony, and influence outcomes through voice and presence. Though roles in daily labor may differ, responsibility within the community is shared. The Norse world relies on cooperation, and cooperation requires inclusion. Between discussions, people rest. They sit on the grass, share food, exchange quiet news. Children wander nearby, absorbing the atmosphere without fully understanding its weight. They learn by watching. They see how disagreements can be addressed without violence. They learn that words, when used carefully, can shape reality. The landscape itself feels involved. Wind moves through tall grass. Clouds drift slowly overhead. The sound of distant water reminds everyone that nature continues alongside human concerns. No decision here feels separate from the land it affects. The earth listens in its own way. Laws cover more than punishment. They define responsibility, inheritance, marriage, trade, and hospitality. They protect travelers and ensure fairness in exchange. They outline what is owed and what is forgiven. In a world without centralized authority, these spoken agreements create trust. Trust allows communities to endure. When a judgment is reached, it is acknowledged quietly. There is no celebration, no sense of defeat. The matter is considered settled. Life moves forward. Lingering resentment would only weaken the whole. The Norse understood that survival depended on maintaining relationships, even strained ones. As the sun shifts position, shadows lengthen. The assembly slowly disperses. People gather their belongings, exchange farewells, and begin the walk home. Paths branch off across the land, each carrying its own small group back toward farms, coasts, and forests. These gatherings happen regularly, marking time as clearly as seasons. They remind everyone that no one stands alone. Decisions are shared. Consequences are communal. Even the most powerful individual remains accountable to the spoken law. In the quiet after the assembly, the land feels calm. The grass bends back into place. Stones remain where they have always been. The air carries a sense of completion, not finality, but resolution. Another matter has been woven into the fabric of memory. In this way, the Norse world holds together. Not through fear, but through agreement. Not through silence, but through careful speech. Words become bridges, connecting people across differences and time. As we drift gently onward, let this open field remain in your thoughts. A place where voices rise and fall in balance. Where listening is as valued as speaking. Where the world is shaped quietly, one spoken promise at a time. The next part of our journey will carry us deeper into daily life, into homes warmed by shared labor and steady routines. For now, rest in the calm knowledge that the Norse world was bound together by words spoken under open sky, patient and enduring, like the land itself. Part 5: The Longhouse and the Shape of Everyday Life. Now we step fully inside the heart of Norse daily existence. We leave the open assembly fields behind and move into a space shaped by warmth, routine, and quiet continuity. This is the Longhouse, the center of Viking life, where days begin and end, where seasons are felt most clearly, and where the ordinary rhythms of living quietly hold the world together. The Longhouse does not stand apart from the land. It settles into it. Built low and wide, often partially set into the earth, it offers shelter without dominance. Turf and timber insulate its walls, protecting those inside from winter winds and summer heat alike. From a distance, it looks almost grown rather than constructed, as though it rose naturally from the soil. As morning comes, the interior stirs gently. The fire at the center of the Longhouse has burned through the night, never fully extinguished. Embers glow softly beneath a thin layer of ash, waiting. Someone rises early and kneels to stir them, adding dry wood with care. Smoke drifts upward toward a small opening in the roof, lingering briefly before finding its way out. The smell is familiar and comforting. It signals continuity. Light enters slowly. There are no large windows. Instead, daylight seeps in through doorways and roof openings, mixing with firelight in a warm, shifting blend. Shadows move across wooden beams. Carved posts support the roof, their shapes worn smooth by time and touch. These carvings are not decoration alone. They are memory, lineage, and protection woven into the structure itself. People wake gradually. There is no sharp division between sleep and work. Children stir near their parents. An elder adjusts a wool blanket and sits quietly, listening to the fire. Someone begins preparing food, grinding grain with steady movements learned long ago. Conversation is minimal at first. The Norse understood the value of silence in the early hours. Words would come later. Meals are simple but sustaining. Porridge, bread, dried fish, and preserved meats form the foundation of daily nourishment. Nothing is wasted. Food reflects planning rather than abundance. Each bite carries the effort of past seasons. Eating is communal, unhurried. Bowls are passed. Hands move naturally. Gratitude is present without ceremony. The longhouse is not only a place of rest. It is a place of work. During the day, the interior becomes active in quiet ways. Wool is spun. Cloth is woven on upright looms. Tools are repaired. Wood is shaped. Children observe, assist, and learn without formal instruction. Skill is absorbed through repetition and presence rather than explanation. Women hold significant authority within this space. They manage household resources, oversee food stores, and make decisions that affect survival through winter. Keys often hang at a woman's belt, a visible sign of responsibility and trust. These keys unlock chests containing grain, tools, and valuables. This is not symbolic. It is practical power, exercised daily. Men move between indoor and outdoor tasks. Some tend fields or animals. Others fish, hunt, or craft. There is flexibility here, shaped by season and need rather than rigid role. Cooperation matters more than hierarchy. A household functions only when effort is shared. Children grow within this environment of inclusion. They are not separated from adult life. They witness birth, illness, aging, and death as part of the same continuous experience. This exposure creates familiarity rather than fear. Life is understood as a cycle, not a series of isolated events. In the afternoon, the longhouse quiets again. Sunlight reaches deeper into the interior now, illuminating dust motes drifting slowly in the air. Someone steps outside to check the weather. Clouds move deliberately across the sky. The smell of damp earth suggests rain later. Adjustments are made without urgency. Tools are covered. Plans shift gently. Hospitality is central to longhouse life. A traveler arriving at the door is welcomed without interrogation. Food is offered. A place near the fire is made. Only after warmth and sustenance are provided are questions asked. In a world shaped by distance and unpredictability, hospitality is protection for everyone. Today's guest could be tomorrow's host. As evening approaches, the longhouse becomes more intimate. Work slows. The fire is fed again. People gather closer together. The outside world recedes into darkness, wind, and distant water. Inside, the space feels held and enclosed, a small universe of warmth and sound. This is when stories return. Not formal sagas yet, but recollections. A successful harvest remembered. A difficult winter recalled. A humorous mistake repeated for the children's delight. Laughter is soft, never sharp. It rises and falls like breath. Music may appear. A simple stringed instrument is played quietly. A voice hums. Rhythm is steady, almost hypnotic. These sounds are not performance. They are presence. They fill the space without demanding attention. The longhouse is also where grief is shared. Loss is not hidden away. When death occurs, it is acknowledged within the same walls that witnessed birth and growth. The deceased is remembered through stories and gestures. Their absence is felt, but their place within memory remains intact. Night deepens. Outside, stars emerge. Inside, firelight becomes the primary source of illumination. People settle into their sleeping spaces along the walls. Cloaks and furs are arranged. Breathing slows. The longhouse exhales collectively. This shared rest matters. Sleeping together creates safety. It reinforces belonging. Dreams unfold beneath the same roof, carried by the same warmth. The boundaries between individual lives blur slightly, replaced by a sense of shared continuity. Through all seasons, the longhouse remains. It witnesses change without being undone by it. Children grow. Elders age. Tools wear down and are replaced. Stories accumulate. The structure absorbs these layers quietly, becoming more than wood and turf. It becomes a living record. This is where Viking life truly unfolds. Not in moments of conflict or spectacle, but in repetition. In care. In attention to small tasks done well. The longhouse teaches patience, resilience, and cooperation without words. As we move gently onward into the next part of the story, carry this image with you. The fire glowing low. The sound of breath and quiet voices. The feeling of being enclosed, protected, and known. Ahead, we will step into belief and ritual more deeply, into the moments where the Norse sought meaning beyond the visible world. But for now, rest here, within the longhouse, where everyday life continues steadily, holding the Norse world together one calm day at a time. Part 6: Quiet Rituals and the Sacred Ordinary. As the days move steadily onward, belief in the Norse world does not appear only in grand myths or distant gods. It lives close to the ground, folded gently into everyday actions. Faith is not confined to special places or rare moments. It moves quietly through daily life, shaping behavior, intention, and attention. In the Norse world, ritual is rarely dramatic. It does not demand spectacle. Instead, it exists in small, repeated gestures that anchor people to something larger than themselves. A hand rests briefly on a carved post before leaving the longhouse. A pause is taken before planting the first seed of the season. A few words are murmured under the breath before setting out on water. These moments are subtle, almost invisible, yet deeply meaningful. The sacred is understood as present, not distant. Nature itself is alive with awareness. Forests are not merely collections of trees. They are spaces with memory and presence. Rivers are not simply water moving downhill. They are paths that connect places, stories, and lives. Even stones are treated with care, for they endure far longer than any person and are believed to witness time in a way humans cannot. Because of this, daily actions are performed with intention. When food is prepared, a small portion may be set aside, not wasted, but offered quietly. This is not always for a named god. Sometimes it is simply an acknowledgement of balance. Taking requires giving. Using requires respect. Survival depends on maintaining this exchange. Seasonal rituals mark the passage of time. As winter loosens its hold and the ground softens, people gather to recognize the return of light. Fires are lit with care. Old tools are repaired or replaced. There is a sense of renewal, not celebration, but readiness. Spring is welcomed as a partner, not a gift. Summer brings different observances. Long days stretch late into the evening. Work is intense but accompanied by gratitude. Fields are watched closely. Weather is read with practiced eyes. When crops grow well, thanks are offered not through excess, but through careful stewardship. Plenty is met with restraint, knowing that abundance never lasts forever. Autumn carries its own quiet weight. Harvest rituals focus on preservation rather than praise. Food is stored methodically. Meat is cured. Grain is dried. Berries are gathered and sealed away. These acts are ritualistic in their repetition, their precision, and their importance. Each task acknowledges the coming winter without fear. Winter itself is a sacred season. Darkness settles early. Cold wraps the land. Movement slows. Inside the longhouse, time feels deeper, thicker. This is when storytelling takes on added significance. Myths are shared not for entertainment alone, but for guidance. They explain why hardship exists and how endurance gives it meaning. The gods, in these stories, are not perfect beings. They struggle. They doubt. They face loss. This mirrors human experience and offers comfort. If even divine figures must endure uncertainty, then human hardship feels less isolating. The stories do not promise rescue. They offer companionship in difficulty. Death is approached with calm acceptance. When someone dies, rituals are simple and grounded. The body is treated with respect. Personal items may be included, not as possessions for another world, but as symbols of identity. The community gathers quietly. There is grief, but it is shared rather than hidden. Mourning is not rushed, yet it does not overwhelm daily life. Burial practices vary, shaped by region and family tradition. Some choose earth, returning the body directly to the land. Others favor fire, believing transformation releases the spirit more freely. Neither is seen as superior. Both are understood as natural transitions within the cycle of existence. Memory plays a central role. To be remembered is a form of continuation. Names spoken aloud keep presence alive. Stories repeated preserve identity. Forgetting is the only true loss. Because of this, lineage matters. Ancestors are honored through acknowledgement rather than worship. Their lives offer lessons, warnings, and reassurance. Children are taught these beliefs gently. They learn through participation rather than instruction. They watch adults pause before certain actions. They hear familiar phrases repeated in moments of uncertainty. Over time, they absorb an understanding of balance, responsibility, and respect without formal explanation. Ritual objects are simple. A carved figurine, a smooth stone kept near the hearth, a piece of wood shaped by hand. These items hold meaning because of use and memory, not because of rarity or value. Their power lies in familiarity. There are no strict boundaries between sacred and ordinary. Work is not separate from belief. Belief is not separate from survival. Everything exists on the same plane, woven together through habit and attention. This creates a sense of stability even in uncertain times. When misfortune occurs, it is not always blamed on divine anger. Instead, it is often seen as part of the broader weave of fate. Reflection follows. Adjustments are made. Offerings may be renewed. The response is thoughtful rather than frantic. This worldview fosters resilience. By accepting uncertainty as natural, the Norse avoid despair. By valuing endurance over reward, they find meaning even in difficulty. By honoring cycles rather than resisting them, they move with time instead of against it. As evening settles once more, ritual returns to its quiet place. A final task is completed. A brief word is spoken. The fire is banked carefully. Outside, darkness deepens, wrapping the land in stillness. Inside, people gather close, grounded by familiarity and shared understanding. Belief does not shout here. It hums softly beneath daily life, steady and present. It shapes choices without demanding attention. It offers comfort without promises. It holds the world together through countless small acts performed with care. As the night grows deeper and the pace slows further, this sense of quiet meaning lingers. Ahead, the story will carry us into moments of expansion and encounter, when the Norse world meets others beyond its familiar edges. For now, rest within this gentle framework of belief, where the sacred lives not above or beyond, but beside the fire, within the land, and inside every thoughtful pause. Part 7: Leaving Home and Meeting the Wider World. By the time a Norse person reached adulthood, the world beyond their home was no longer abstract. It was known through stories, trade goods, visiting travelers, and the quiet awareness that shorelines did not mark endings, only transitions. The decision to travel was rarely impulsive. It came from necessity, opportunity, or obligation rather than restlessness. Land was finite. Resources were uneven. Connections mattered. Over time, movement outward became a practical extension of daily life. Most journeys began with preparation rather than excitement. Boats were checked carefully. Food stores were measured with realism, not optimism. Wool clothing was repaired and layered for cold, damp conditions. There was no illusion that travel was glamorous. It was work, and often uncomfortable. Seasickness, cramped conditions, and long stretches of monotony were expected parts of the experience. What made travel worthwhile was not the act itself, but what it enabled. Trade was one of the primary reasons for travel. Norse communities did not exist in isolation. They were linked to a wide network that stretched across northern and eastern Europe and gradually farther south. Furs, amber, iron tools, wool textiles, and crafted goods moved outward from Scandinavia. In return came silver, spices, glassware, silk, and ideas that reshaped how people understood the world. These exchanges were not rare events. They were ongoing and cumulative, building familiarity over generations. When Norse traders arrived in foreign ports, they were not always strangers. Many locations had seen similar ships before. Relationships developed slowly, based on reliability and reputation. A trader who honored agreements and returned consistently was valued. Trust mattered more than force. Violence disrupted trade, and trade was too important to treat casually. While conflict did occur, it was not the default condition of contact. Settlements emerged along major trade routes, often in places that allowed access to both land and water. These were not colonies in the later sense of imposed control. They were practical communities formed by people who recognized opportunity. Over time, Norse settlers adapted to local conditions. They learned new farming techniques, adopted local customs, and formed families with people from other cultures. Identity remained important, but it was flexible rather than rigid. Language reflected this adaptability. Norse travelers picked up foreign words, especially for goods, measurements, and administrative concepts. These words filtered back home through conversation and storytelling. Vocabulary expanded alongside awareness. The world felt larger, but also more interconnected. Differences were noted, but not always judged. Practical usefulness mattered more than cultural purity. Trade routes to the east followed rivers rather than open seas. These journeys required different skills. Boats were carried over land between waterways. Negotiations were conducted across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Eastern trade connected Norse travelers to vast networks that extended deep into regions with long-established cities, markets, and political systems. Exposure to these environments challenged assumptions about governance, wealth, and scale. Southern routes brought encounters with societies shaped by written law, centralized authority, and formal religion. Norse visitors observed stone buildings, organized markets, and administrative systems unfamiliar at home. These experiences did not erase Norse traditions, but they influenced them. Ideas about coinage, record keeping, and urban organization slowly found their way north, adapted to local needs rather than copied outright. Not all encounters were peaceful. Competition over resources, misunderstandings, and political tension sometimes led to violence. Raiding occurred, particularly in regions where wealth was concentrated and defenses were limited. These actions were not random. They were strategic and often seasonal. However, they represented only one aspect of contact. Raiding gained attention because it was disruptive, not because it was constant. For those involved, raiding was not framed as chaos. It followed rules, expectations, and calculations. Participants were usually young men seeking wealth, status, or repayment of debt. Raids were planned with the same attention given to farming or trade. Risks were weighed carefully. Failure could mean death or enslavement. Success brought resources that benefited extended families and communities, not just individuals. At home, the impact of travel was visible. Foreign objects entered daily use. Silver coins were cut and weighed rather than spent whole. Decorative styles shifted subtly. New food items appeared in limited quantities. Stories from abroad became part of communal memory. Children grew up hearing about places far beyond the horizon, not as fantasies, but as locations connected through known routes and named landmarks. These stories were practical in nature. They included information about weather patterns, political conditions, and economic opportunities. A tale about a distant city might include advice about when to arrive, who to avoid, and what goods were valued there. Storytelling served as informal education, preparing the next generation for similar journeys. Not everyone traveled. Many Norse people lived their entire lives within a small region. However, even those who stayed felt the influence of outward movement. Decisions made elsewhere affected local markets, alliances, and security. The wider world pressed inward through trade goods, news, and returning travelers. Travel also reshaped social structure. Wealth gained abroad could alter a family's standing at home. This sometimes created tension, particularly when traditional hierarchies were challenged. The Norse response to this was negotiation rather than suppression. Legal assemblies addressed disputes over inheritance, land purchases, and obligations created through trade wealth. The system adapted without collapsing. Religious exposure was another consequence of contact. Norse travelers encountered belief systems organized differently from their own. Some found them compelling. Others viewed them with skepticism. Over time, this exposure planted questions rather than answers. Belief did not shift suddenly. It accumulated slowly, shaped by experience rather than decree. For individuals, travel altered perspective. Distance provided comparison. Customs once assumed universal were revealed as local. This awareness fostered pragmatism. The Norse did not abandon their identity easily, but they were capable of adjustment when circumstances required it. Survival had always depended on flexibility. Returning home was often quieter than departure. There were no formal celebrations. Goods were unloaded. Accounts were given. Obligations were settled. Life resumed its familiar patterns, but with small changes that accumulated over time. A household might be better supplied for winter. A family might have new connections. A young person might begin preparing for a journey of their own. The Norse world expanded gradually through these repeated movements. There was no single moment when isolation ended. Instead, familiarity spread outward and inward simultaneously. The horizon moved farther away, but home remained central. By the end of this period of increasing contact, the Norse were no longer defined solely by their land of origin. They were part of a wider system of exchange, influence, and adaptation. This did not erase their traditions. It tested them, reshaped them, and in many cases strengthened them. In the next part of the story, attention will turn to how this expanding world affected power, leadership, and social organization within Norse society itself. For now, the focus rests on movement that was deliberate, grounded, and deeply connected to everyday necessity rather than legend. Part 8. Power, leadership, and the gradual rise of kings. As Norse society expanded outward through trade, settlement, and contact with other cultures, changes also unfolded within its internal structure. Power did not arrive suddenly or through conquest alone. It accumulated slowly, shaped by land ownership, reputation, family alliances, and the ability to manage people rather than dominate them. Leadership in the Norse world was practical before it was symbolic, rooted in responsibility and negotiation more than command. In early Norse communities, authority was local and distributed. Households formed the foundation of social organization, and influence grew outward from there. A respected landowner, often referred to as a chieftain, held power because others trusted his judgment, relied on his resources, and believed he could protect communal interests. This authority was not absolute. It required constant maintenance through fairness, generosity, and participation in legal assemblies. A leader who failed to listen or abused his position risked losing support. Wealth played a role in leadership, but not in isolation. Land ownership was particularly important, as land meant food, shelter, and stability. A leader who controlled productive farmland could support dependents, host gatherings, and provide aid during difficult seasons. This created loyalty, but it also created expectation. Leadership was reciprocal. Protection and support flowed both ways, binding individuals into networks of obligation. Reputation mattered as much as resources. A leader's word carried weight only if it had proven reliable over time. Decisions made at assemblies, settlements negotiated after disputes, and responses to crises all contributed to how a leader was perceived. Stories of good judgment spread just as quickly as stories of failure. Memory served as an informal record, reinforcing accountability. As contact with other societies increased, the idea of centralized authority became more familiar. Norse travelers encountered kings who ruled large territories through formal structures, written laws, and standing forces. These systems contrasted with the Norse preference for local autonomy and spoken law. Initially, they were observed rather than adopted. However, over time, some Norse leaders recognized the advantages of greater consolidation, particularly in regions where competition for land and resources intensified. The gradual emergence of kingship did not eliminate older forms of leadership. Instead, it led authority. Kings relied on local chieftains to enforce decisions and maintain order. In return, chieftains gained status, protection, and access to broader networks. This arrangement was unstable at times, requiring negotiation and compromise. Authority remained something that had to be earned repeatedly, not assumed permanently. Kingship in the Norse world was not initially hereditary in a strict sense. Lineage mattered, but so did capability. A ruler who failed to secure loyalty or manage conflict could be challenged or replaced. This created a political environment where ambition existed alongside restraint. Violence was possible, but it was costly and unpredictable. Alliances through marriage, gift-giving, and shared interest were often more effective than force. Assemblies continued to play a central role even as kings emerged. Laws were still spoken publicly. Disputes were still addressed through negotiation. Kings who ignored these traditions faced resistance. Authority that aligned with existing customs was more durable than authority imposed from above. As a result, Norse kingship developed in dialogue with tradition rather than in opposition to it. Military leadership was another pathway to power, but it followed similar principles. A successful war leader gained followers through demonstrated competence and fair distribution of rewards. Loyalty was personal rather than institutional. Warriors chose to follow leaders they trusted, and that trust depended on consistency and shared benefit. Leadership in battle reinforced leadership at home, but it did not replace other forms of authority. The accumulation of wealth through trade and travel further complicated social structure. Individuals who returned with silver and goods could alter their standing regardless of lineage. This mobility introduced tension, particularly when new wealth challenged established families. Legal systems adapted to address disputes over land purchases, inheritance, and debt. The emphasis remained on balance rather than exclusion. Religion intersected with leadership in subtle ways. Kings and chieftains were expected to uphold traditional rituals and ensure communal well-being. Their role included maintaining favorable relationships with the unseen forces believed to influence harvests, weather, and fate. Failure in this area could be interpreted as a sign of unfitness to lead. Success reinforced legitimacy. Over time, some leaders began to consolidate territory more deliberately. Control over key trade routes, fertile land, or strategic ports provided leverage. These leaders sought recognition beyond their immediate region, positioning themselves as rulers rather than simply influential figures. This shift was gradual and uneven, varying by location and circumstance. Resistance to centralization persisted. Many Norse communities valued autonomy deeply and viewed excessive authority with suspicion. The legal tradition, emphasis on spoken agreement, and collective decision-making all acted as counterweights to unchecked power. Kings who succeeded did so by working within these constraints rather than attempting to dismantle them. The rise of kingship altered social expectations. Loyalty expanded from household and local leader to broader political identity. Obligations became more complex, extending beyond immediate community. This created new opportunities for stability but also new sources of conflict, particularly when royal ambitions exceeded local tolerance. Despite these changes, everyday life for most Norse people remained grounded in familiar routines. Farming, crafting, and household management continued much as before. Leadership shifts affected taxation, military obligation, and legal authority, but they did not transform daily existence overnight. Change accumulated slowly, often unnoticed until it became difficult to reverse. By the end of this period, Norse society existed in a state of transition. Local autonomy remained strong, but centralized authority was no longer unfamiliar. Kingship had emerged not as a replacement for tradition, but as an extension shaped by necessity, exposure, and adaptation. In the next part of the story, attention will turn to how belief, leadership, and external contact intersected in moments of significant change, particularly as new religious ideas began to take root and challenge long-standing traditions. Part 11. Remembering the Viking Age and the Making of Memory. Once the Viking Age had passed as a living reality, it did not vanish from consciousness. Instead, it entered memory, where it would be shaped, preserved, and reinterpreted by generations who no longer lived within its conditions. This process of remembering was not neutral. Memory was influenced by politics, religion, literacy, and the needs of later societies. What survived was not a perfect record of the past, but a version of it shaped by context and intention. In the generations immediately following the end of the Viking Age, memory remained largely oral. Stories continued to circulate within families and communities, passed down through repetition rather than documentation. These stories emphasized lineage, notable ancestors, and events that explained present circumstances. Memory functioned as explanation. It connected land ownership, social standing, and family alliances to earlier actions and decisions. As writing became more common, especially under Christian influence, these oral traditions began to be recorded. This shift marked a significant transformation. Writing fixed stories in place. Variations that had once evolved with each telling were reduced or eliminated. Choices had to be made about which version of a story to preserve. Those choices reflected the values and priorities of the time in which the writing occurred, not necessarily the time being described. Many of the sagas were written centuries after the events they recount. Their authors lived in societies shaped by Christian ethics, centralized authority, and written law. As a result, earlier figures were often portrayed through later moral frameworks. Pagan belief systems were described with a degree of distance, sometimes admiration, sometimes criticism. Violence was contextualized, justified, or condemned depending on how it aligned with contemporary values. This process did not erase older traditions, but it reshaped them. Heroes became more consistent. Events gained clearer narrative arcs. Ambiguity diminished. The past became a story with beginnings, conflicts, and resolutions, even when real life had been far less orderly. Political motives also influenced memory. Emerging kingdoms benefited from linking their authority to legendary ancestors. Lineage claims strengthened legitimacy. Stories emphasizing unity, destiny, or divine favor served present needs. In this way, memory became a tool of governance as well as identity. Christian institutions played a major role in shaping how the Viking Age was remembered. Monastic writers preserved historical material, but they interpreted it through Christian worldview. Pagan rituals were often framed as misguided rather than malicious. Conversion narratives emphasized inevitability and progress. This reinforced the idea that the Viking Age belonged firmly to the past, replaced by a more orderly present. At the same time, nostalgia persisted. The memory of independence, local autonomy, and personal reputation resonated in societies experiencing increased regulation and centralized control. Stories of earlier figures who acted decisively and lived by personal codes offered contrast to bureaucratic systems. This nostalgia did not necessarily reflect desire to return to earlier conditions, but it provided a sense of cultural depth. Memory was also selective. Everyday life, which had defined most Norse experience, was underrepresented. Farming routines, household labor, and quiet continuity rarely appeared in recorded narratives. Instead, memory favored conflict, travel, and exceptional individuals. This skewed perception, making the Viking Age appear more dramatic and violent than it was for most people. Material culture contributed to memory as well. Objects survived where stories faded. Burial mounds, runestones, and artifacts remain visible reminders of earlier generations. These physical remnants invited interpretation. They became focal points for storytelling, speculation, and identity. Over time, they were incorporated into local lore, reinforcing continuity with the past. Language preserved memory in subtle ways. Place names reflected earlier settlement patterns. Words related to law, governance, and social organization carried traces of older systems. Even as society changed, these linguistic remnants maintained connection to earlier structures. The transition from lived memory to historical memory created distance. The Viking Age became something observed rather than experienced. This allowed for idealization. Harsh reality softened. Complexity reduced. Stories became symbols rather than records. The past was used to explain the present, justify authority, or inspire identity. Outside Scandinavia, memory followed different paths. In regions affected by Norse raids or settlement, the Viking Age was remembered primarily through disruption. Monastic chronicles emphasized destruction and suffering. These accounts reflected genuine trauma, but they represented one perspective among many. Over time, these narratives influenced broader European views of Vikings as primarily violent actors. These external memories persisted alongside internal traditions, creating divergent interpretations. The same period could be remembered as expansion and opportunity in one region, and as invasion and loss in another. Neither perspective was complete on its own. Modern interpretations of the Viking Age draw heavily from these layered memories. Popular culture often combines saga narratives, archaeological findings, and later romanticized interpretations. This blending creates compelling images but obscures everyday reality. The emphasis on warfare and heroism overshadows agriculture, law, and domestic life. Scholarly approaches seek to balance these narratives by examining evidence critically. Archaeology, linguistics, and comparative analysis provide tools for reconstructing a more nuanced picture. These methods reveal patterns of settlement, trade, and adaptation that contradict simplistic portrayals. Memory continues to evolve. Each generation revisits the Viking Age through its own concerns. Questions about identity, migration, power, and belief find resonance in this period because it involved visible transformation. The Viking Age serves as a mirror reflecting contemporary interests as much as historical reality. Importantly, remembering is not about accuracy alone. It is about meaning. The Viking Age endures because it represents a moment when societies adapted creatively to challenging conditions. That adaptability remains relevant. The details matter, but so does the broader lesson of change without erasure. By understanding how memory was constructed, it becomes possible to distinguish between history and interpretation. This distinction does not diminish the past. It enriches it. Recognizing how stories were shaped allows appreciation for both the events themselves and the societies that remembered them. In the next part of the story, attention will shift from memory to material evidence. The focus will move toward archaeology and what physical remains reveal about daily life, belief, and adaptation beyond what stories alone can tell. Part 12. What the ground preserves and what objects reveal. When written memory is limited or shaped by later interpretation, physical evidence becomes essential. Archaeology provides a different kind of record, one that does not speak in narrative form but instead offers fragments of lived reality. These fragments require careful interpretation. They do not explain themselves. They must be examined in context, compared across regions, and understood as products of ordinary behavior rather than exceptional moments. Through archaeology, the Viking Age becomes less dramatic and more grounded, revealing patterns of daily life that written sources often overlook. Archaeological evidence of Norse life is widespread and varied. Farmsteads, burial sites, workshops, trade centers, and temporary camps all contribute pieces to the larger picture. Together, they demonstrate that most Norse people lived stable, labor-intensive lives centered on agriculture and household production. The popular image of constant movement is not supported by material evidence. Instead, long-term settlement and continuity dominate the record. Farm remains are among the most informative archaeological sites. Excavations reveal longhouses rebuilt multiple times on the same footprint, indicating generational continuity rather than frequent relocation. Soil analysis shows crop rotation and land management strategies designed to maintain fertility. Animal bones reveal diets shaped by season, region, and necessity. These findings reinforce the idea that Norse society depended heavily on careful planning and environmental knowledge. Household artifacts further illuminate daily routines. Cooking vessels, grinding stones, spindle whorls, and loom weights appear consistently across sites. Their presence indicates that food preparation and textile production were constant concerns. The scale of textile tools suggests that clothing production was not occasional but continuous. Wool processing required repeated effort, from shearing to spinning to weaving. This work was essential for survival in northern climates and consumed a significant portion of household labor. Workshops uncovered in settlements show specialized craft production. Ironworking sites reveal controlled processes for smelting and shaping tools. The presence of slag and standardized tool forms indicate skill transmission across generations. These were not experimental or improvised activities. They followed established methods refined over time. Craft knowledge was practical and valued, integrated into household economies rather than separated into distinct professional classes. Trade centers provide evidence of wider connections. Excavations uncover imported goods such as glass beads, silver coins, and ceramics from distant regions. These items appear alongside local products, suggesting exchange rather than replacement. Trade did not disrupt local production. It supplemented it. The distribution of imported goods across settlements indicates that trade benefits were not limited to elites. Ordinary households participated indirectly through networks of exchange. Coinage offers particularly clear insight into economic practice. Coins were often cut into pieces and weighed rather than spent as whole units. This suggests that value was understood in terms of material worth rather than symbolic currency. Weighing scales found in settlements reinforce this interpretation. Economic transactions relied on trust, measurement, and reputation rather than centralized monetary systems. Burial sites are among the most complex sources of evidence. They reveal belief, identity, and social differentiation, but they must be interpreted carefully. Grave goods vary widely by region and period. Some graves contain weapons, tools, and jewelry. Others contain only modest items or none at all. This variation reflects choice, status, and evolving belief rather than a single cultural standard. Weapon burials, often emphasized in popular narratives, represent a minority of cases. Most individuals were buried without arms. This suggests that martial identity, while present, was not universal. Weapons in graves may reflect social role, personal identity, or symbolic meaning rather than direct participation in conflict. Over time, the frequency of weapon burials declines, aligning with broader social changes. Burial orientation and structure also shift over time. Earlier graves often follow traditional practices, while later graves show influence from Christian customs. Transitional graves containing mixed elements demonstrate gradual change rather than abrupt conversion. These patterns confirm that belief systems overlapped for extended periods, with individuals and families navigating uncertainty rather than choosing sides immediately. Settlement layout reveals social organization. Houses cluster in ways that suggest cooperation rather than isolation. Shared spaces for work and gathering indicate communal interaction. Fences, pathways, and storage structures demonstrate planned use of space. These layouts contradict the idea of purely individualistic households. Community coordination was necessary for survival. Temporary sites, such as seasonal fishing camps or trading outposts, add further depth. These locations show that mobility existed alongside stability. Norse people moved strategically rather than randomly. Seasonal movement complemented permanent settlement, allowing access to resources without abandoning established homes. Environmental evidence supports this interpretation. Pollen analysis and soil layers reveal changes in land use over time. Deforestation patterns show controlled expansion rather than reckless exploitation. The Norse modified their environment deliberately, balancing short-term need with long-term sustainability. Failures occurred in some regions, but they were exceptions rather than norms. Archaeology also challenges assumptions about gender roles. Graves containing tools traditionally associated with women appear alongside those containing weapons. Household artifacts show overlapping responsibilities. This evidence suggests that gender roles were defined by practicality rather than rigid ideology. While patterns existed, flexibility was common. Children appear in the archaeological record primarily through burial evidence. Grave goods associated with children indicate that they were recognized as individuals with identity and belonging. This contradicts assumptions that childhood held little significance. The investment in child burials reflects emotional attachment and social value. One of the most important contributions of archaeology is its ability to reveal continuity. Change did not erase earlier practices overnight. Instead, layers accumulate gradually. New structures appear alongside old ones. Tools evolve rather than disappear. Beliefs overlap rather than replace. This layered evidence reinforces the idea that the Viking Age ended through transformation, not collapse. Archaeology also corrects written bias. Chronicles often emphasize conflict because it disrupted established systems. Material evidence shows that conflict was episodic rather than constant. Most settlements show no signs of destruction. Life continued uninterrupted for long periods. This stability is essential to understanding how Norse societies endured. The limitations of archaeology must also be acknowledged. Organic materials decay. Everyday items leave less trace than durable ones. Absence of evidence does not equal absence of activity. Interpretation requires caution. Archaeologists rely on patterns, not certainty. Despite these limitations, archaeology provides a grounded perspective. It shifts focus from extraordinary events to ordinary lives. It reveals effort, adaptation, and continuity. It shows that Norse society was complex, resilient, and pragmatic. In the next part of the story, attention will turn toward daily life across age and gender, examining how childhood, adulthood, aging, and social responsibility were experienced within this material framework. Part 13: Age, Responsibility, and the Structure of a Human Life. Understanding Norse society requires looking not only at belief systems, leadership, or material culture, but at how a human life unfolded from beginning to end. Age mattered deeply in shaping responsibility, expectation, and status. Life was not divided into sharply defined stages by law or ceremony, but by capability and contribution. From early childhood onward, individuals were integrated into the functioning of the household and community in ways that reflected practical need rather than abstract ideals. Childhood in the Norse world was not isolated from adult life. Children were present in nearly all aspects of daily activity. They observed farming, animal care, craft production, and food preparation from a young age. Learning occurred through imitation rather than instruction. Tasks were introduced gradually, matched to physical ability and attention rather than age alone. A child who could carry water did so. One who could watch animals was expected to remain attentive. Responsibility expanded naturally as competence grew. This integration fostered early awareness of consequence. Children learned quickly that actions affected others. Carelessness could result in lost animals, spoiled food, or damaged tools. Correction was typically immediate and practical rather than punitive. Mistakes were treated as opportunities to learn rather than moral failures. This approach reinforced accountability without fostering fear. Family structure supported this system. Extended households meant that children were surrounded by multiple adults with varied skills. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and older siblings all contributed to upbringing. Authority was distributed. A child might receive guidance from different individuals depending on the task at hand. This reduced dependence on any single figure and reinforced communal responsibility. Adolescence was marked less by ritual than by increasing expectation. As physical strength and endurance developed, young people were expected to take on heavier labor. Boys and girls both participated in agricultural work, animal care, and household production. Differences in task allocation emerged gradually, shaped by strength, skill, and local custom rather than rigid rule. For young men, adulthood was associated with the ability to provide and protect. This did not necessarily mean warfare. It meant contributing labor, participating in legal assemblies, and upholding agreements. Travel and trade offered opportunities to build reputation and acquire resources, but these paths were not universal. Many men remained within their home communities, focusing on farming and local responsibility. For young women, adulthood brought increased authority within the household. Women managed food storage, textile production, and resource distribution. These roles required planning, organization, and decision-making. The success of a household depended heavily on these skills. Women's work was not auxiliary. It was central to survival. Marriage functioned as both personal and economic partnership. It formalized alliances between families and structured inheritance. While marriages were often arranged, consent and negotiation played roles. Marriage agreements outlined property rights, responsibilities, and expectations. These agreements were enforceable through law, reinforcing the seriousness of the institution. Within marriage, authority was shared but divided by domain. Men often managed external relations, legal matters, and heavy labor. Women controlled internal household management. This division was not absolute. Flexibility existed, particularly in smaller households or during periods of absence. Widows often assumed full control of property and decision-making, demonstrating that authority was tied to responsibility rather than gender alone. Parenthood expanded responsibility further. Raising children required sustained effort and cooperation. Mothers and fathers both participated in upbringing, though daily care often fell more heavily on women due to proximity and task alignment. Fathers contributed through instruction, example, and legal advocacy on behalf of their children. Parental authority emphasized preparation for independence rather than obedience for its own sake. Middle age marked a period of peak responsibility. Individuals in this stage often managed households, participated actively in assemblies, and served as witnesses or mediators in disputes. Their experience carried weight. Decisions made by this group shaped community stability. Reputation built over decades mattered most during this period. Elders held respected but not unchallenged positions. Age brought experience, memory, and perspective. Elders were often consulted on matters of custom, lineage, and precedent. However, authority did not automatically increase with age. An elder who could no longer contribute meaningfully or who demonstrated poor judgment might be respected but not deferred to unquestioningly. Respect was linked to ongoing relevance rather than age alone. Aging was integrated into household life. Elders remained within family structures rather than being separated. Their continued presence allowed for knowledge transmission and emotional continuity. Physical decline was accommodated through task adjustment rather than withdrawal. Elders performed lighter work, supervised children, or contributed through storytelling and instruction. Illness and disability were addressed pragmatically. Temporary injury was common in labor-intensive societies. Communities adapted by redistributing tasks. Long-term disability posed greater challenges, but care was typically provided within households. Survival depended on cooperation. Exclusion weakened the group as a whole. Death was approached as an expected stage rather than a failure. Preparation for death included practical arrangements such as inheritance planning and verbal instruction. These preparations reduced conflict and reinforced continuity. Death rituals emphasized remembrance rather than separation. The deceased remained present through memory and story. Gender roles, while present, were not simplistic. Archaeological and legal evidence shows that women could own property, initiate divorce, and pursue legal cases. Men engaged in domestic tasks when necessary. Roles reflected efficiency rather than ideology. Societal expectations existed, but they allowed for adaptation. Sexuality and relationships were governed by social norms that emphasized responsibility and consequence. Infidelity, abandonment, and abuse were addressed through legal mechanisms. Reputation mattered. Actions carried social cost. This system discouraged behavior that threatened household stability. The life course in Norse society was structured by contribution rather than age markers. Transition points were recognized through changes in expectation rather than ceremony. A person was considered mature when they could fulfill obligations. Old age was acknowledged when capacity declined. These transitions were fluid rather than fixed. This approach created resilience. Individuals were valued for what they could offer at each stage of life. There was no period considered unproductive by default. Children learned. Adults worked. Elders advised. Each role supported the others. Understanding this structure clarifies why Norse society functioned as it did. Stability depended on interdependence across age and gender. Identity was formed through participation rather than classification. Life was understood as a continuous process of increasing, sustaining, and eventually passing on responsibility. In the next part of the story, attention will shift toward work itself, examining how labor was organized across seasons, how tasks were coordinated within households and communities, and how work shaped both identity and survival in the Norse world. Part 14: Work, Labor, and the Rhythm of the Seasons. Work in the Norse world was not understood as a separate sphere of life. It was life. Survival depended on continuous effort coordinated across households, communities, and seasons. Labor shaped identity more consistently than belief or status. What a person could do, and how reliably they could do it, mattered more than abstract roles or inherited titles. This emphasis on practical contribution created a society organized around rhythm rather than schedule, necessity rather than ambition. The year was divided not by numbered months, but by seasonal demands. Each season carried its own priorities, and success depended on anticipating change rather than reacting to it. The Norse calendar followed the natural world closely. Weather patterns, daylight length, and animal behavior dictated when work began and ended. Ignoring these signals carried risk. Spring marked the beginning of intensified labor. As snow retreated and ground softened, fields were prepared carefully. Soil was broken using simple plows pulled by animals or people. The work was slow and physically demanding. Tools required constant maintenance. A damaged plow or dulled blade could delay planting and threaten harvest. Repairs were often made immediately rather than postponed, reflecting awareness of narrow windows for action. Planting required coordination. Families often worked together to complete tasks quickly during favorable conditions. Crops were chosen based on soil quality, climate, and prior experience. Barley and rye were common staples due to their resilience. Success depended on experience passed down through observation rather than experimentation. Innovation occurred, but cautiously. Summer brought sustained effort rather than relief. Fields required monitoring. Weeds were controlled manually. Livestock needed constant attention. Animals were moved between grazing areas to prevent overuse. Fishing and hunting supplemented diet during this period, providing protein while preserving stored food for winter. Summer was also the season for repairs and construction, as longer daylight allowed extended work hours. Craft production increased during summer as well. Timber was cut and shaped. Boats were repaired. Tools were forged or adjusted. These activities required planning, as materials needed to be gathered earlier. Ironworking depended on charcoal production, which in turn depended on wood supply. Each task linked to others in a chain of preparation. Autumn was the most demanding season. Harvest determined survival. Crops were gathered quickly to avoid loss to weather. Grain was dried and stored carefully to prevent spoilage. Animals not intended for winter breeding were slaughtered. Meat preservation required precise timing and technique. Salting, smoking, and drying were labor-intensive and time-sensitive. Failure at this stage could result in starvation months later. Food storage was a central concern. Storage pits, chests, and containers were inspected and repaired. Knowledge of preservation was essential. Women often led these efforts due to their central role in household management, but assistance was communal. Children participated where possible, learning through involvement. Winter shifted labor indoors. Physical exertion decreased, but work did not stop. Textile production dominated this period. Wool processed earlier was spun and woven into clothing, blankets, and sails. This work required patience and precision. It was repetitive but essential. Clothing quality directly affected health and mobility. Poor garments increased risk of illness and injury. Tool maintenance continued throughout winter. Wooden implements were reshaped. Metal tools were sharpened. Nets were repaired. Planning for the coming year occurred during this period. Decisions about planting, breeding, and travel were discussed and adjusted based on experience. Winter allowed reflection, but always with purpose. Work was organized primarily at the household level. Extended families pooled labor. Larger tasks required cooperation between households. Building projects, harvest assistance, and seasonal movement depended on shared effort. This cooperation was not altruistic. It was reciprocal. Assistance given created obligation. Obligation ensured future support. There was little concept of leisure as separate from work. Rest occurred naturally through seasonal variation rather than scheduled breaks. Winter evenings allowed for storytelling and social interaction, but these moments coexisted with productive activity. Idleness was discouraged not through moral condemnation, but through practical necessity. Specialization existed, but within limits. Some individuals developed reputations for particular skills, such as smithing or carpentry. These specialists served their communities, but they were rarely isolated from other labor. Most people retained multiple competencies to ensure flexibility. Dependence on a single skill increased vulnerability. Labor shaped social relationships. Reliability earned respect. Laziness carried social cost. However, hardship was understood. Illness, injury, and misfortune were accommodated through redistribution of work. Communities balanced expectation with compassion because long-term survival required maintaining group cohesion. Gender influenced labor patterns, but not rigidly. While some tasks were associated more strongly with men or women, necessity overrode convention. Women performed physically demanding work when needed. Men engaged in domestic tasks when circumstances required it. Efficiency mattered more than adherence to norms. Children learned work gradually. Tasks increased in complexity and responsibility over time. This learning process emphasized observation, repetition, and correction rather than instruction. Competence was valued more than speed. Mistakes were expected and addressed directly. Work also defined moral character. Honoring agreements, fulfilling obligations, and contributing consistently formed the basis of reputation. These values extended beyond labor into legal and social contexts. A person known for diligence was trusted more broadly. Failure in work carried consequences, but not always punishment. Crop failure affected entire communities. In these cases, response focused on adaptation rather than blame. Sharing resources, relocating temporarily, or adjusting future plans were common responses. Resilience depended on collective action. Environmental constraints shaped labor decisions. Soil quality, climate variability, and resource availability limited options. The Norse adapted through diversification rather than intensification. They balanced farming with fishing, hunting, and trade to reduce dependence on any single source. This labor system created stability without stagnation. Change occurred through accumulation rather than disruption. Techniques evolved slowly. Tools improved incrementally. Knowledge passed across generations through practice rather than documentation. Work also structured time perception. The year felt cyclical rather than linear. Success depended on remembering past seasons and anticipating future ones. Memory functioned as planning tool. Experience guided decision-making more than innovation. Understanding work in the Norse world reveals why society functioned as it did. Survival required coordination, foresight, and mutual reliance. Labor was not simply economic activity. It was social glue. It connected individuals to land, community, and time. In the next part of the story, attention will turn toward conflict within this labor-based society. The focus will be on how disputes arose, how violence was regulated, and how law attempted to balance personal honor with communal stability. Part 15: Disputes, Violence, and the Limits of Law. In a society built on shared labor, interdependence, and reputation, conflict was inevitable. Disagreements arose from competition over land, livestock, inheritance, marriage arrangements, and broken agreements. The Norse did not expect harmony at all times, nor did they imagine conflict as a failure of society. Instead, they developed systems to manage dispute in ways that limited long-term damage. Violence existed, but it was regulated, contextualized, and constrained by social expectation and legal structure. Most disputes began at a small scale. A boundary stone moved. An animal strayed and damaged crops. A promise was made and not fulfilled. These incidents were common and did not immediately escalate. Initial responses emphasized discussion and restitution. Neighbors spoke directly. Family members intervened. The goal was to restore balance without drawing in the wider community. When direct resolution failed, dispute-centered formal legal space. Assemblies provided structured settings where grievances could be presented publicly. This public nature mattered. Speaking a claim before witnesses created accountability. False accusations carried reputational risk. Silence in the face of accusation could imply guilt. The legal process depended heavily on participation and presence. Evidence in these cases relied on testimony rather than physical proof. Witnesses were critical. A person's reputation influenced credibility. Consistent behavior over time mattered more than isolated statements. This made long-term conduct central to legal standing. Someone known for fairness and reliability was more likely to be believed than someone with a history of conflict. Compensation played a central role in dispute resolution. Rather than seeking punishment for its own sake, Norse law emphasized restitution. Payments of goods, silver, or labor aimed to repair harm and prevent further escalation. The value of compensation reflected the severity of the offense and the status of those involved, but it was not arbitrary. Established norms guided assessment. Feuds emerged when compensation was refused, inadequate, or contested. Feuding was not random violence. It followed recognized patterns. Targets were chosen deliberately. Timing mattered. The intent was not destruction, but pressure. Feuds were risky because they could spiral, drawing in extended families and allies. For this reason, they were considered a last resort rather than a first response. Even within feuds, restraint existed. Attacks often occurred in specific contexts, such as travel or known meeting places. Surprise violence within households was condemned. Killing carried consequences beyond immediate retaliation. It created legal and social obligations that could persist across generations. The threat of escalation acted as deterrent. Families weighed the cost of continued conflict against the benefit of resolution. Assemblies frequently intervened to broker settlements once violence occurred. The longer a feud persisted, the more pressure mounted to resolve it. Community stability depended on limiting these conflicts. Outlawry represented one of the most severe legal responses. An outlaw lost legal protection and could be harmed without penalty. This punishment was reserved for individuals who repeatedly violated norms or refused to engage in legal resolution. Outlawry did not remove a person physically, but it removed them socially. Survival became difficult without community support. This punishment highlights the centrality of belonging. Law functioned not through centralized enforcement, but through collective participation. Exclusion was effective because survival depended on cooperation. To be outside the law was to be outside society. Violence associated with honor followed similar constraints. Honor did not require constant defense through aggression. It required appropriate response. Overreaction damaged reputation. Failure to respond could also carry cost. Navigating this balance required judgment and consultation. Individuals rarely acted entirely alone. Weapons were tools, not symbols of entitlement. Carrying arms was common due to practical needs, but using them improperly carried social consequence. Lethal violence demanded justification. Without it, retaliation and legal penalty followed. This discouraged impulsive action. Law also regulated accidental harm. Injuries caused unintentionally were addressed through compensation rather than blame. This distinction mattered. It acknowledged the realities of labor-intensive life where accidents were frequent. The legal system aimed to manage consequence rather than assign moral fault indiscriminately. Women participated actively in dispute resolution. They brought cases, negotiated settlements, and acted as witnesses. Their involvement reinforced the idea that law governed households as well as public space. Disputes involving marriage, inheritance, and property often depended on women's testimony and authority. The presence of law did not eliminate inequality. Status influenced outcomes. Wealthier families could afford compensation more easily. Powerful allies mattered. However, the system limited abuse by requiring public process. Decisions were visible. Reputation could be damaged by perceived injustice. This visibility created pressure toward fairness, even when outcomes were uneven. As kingship strengthened, legal systems became more centralized. Royal authority sought to monopolize violence and standardize punishment. This reduced the role of feuds but increased reliance on enforcement. While this brought greater stability in some areas, it also reduced local autonomy. The shift was gradual and uneven, reflecting negotiation between tradition and authority. Christian influence also reshaped attitudes toward violence. Teachings emphasizing restraint and forgiveness introduced new moral frameworks. However, these ideas did not immediately replace existing norms. Instead, they layered additional expectations onto established practices. Over time, they supported the move toward centralized law and reduced tolerance for private violence. Despite these changes, conflict never disappeared. It remained part of human interaction. What distinguished Norse society was not the absence of violence, but the effort to contain it within known limits. Law existed to preserve social continuity rather than impose abstract justice. Understanding these systems clarifies why Norse society endured. Conflict was expected and managed. Law was participatory and flexible. Violence was constrained by consequence. These mechanisms allowed communities to absorb tension without fracturing permanently. In the next part of the story, attention will turn toward the role of travel, migration, and settlement beyond Scandinavia, examining how Norse communities adapted to new environments and how identity persisted outside the homeland. Part 16: Migration, Settlement, and Life Beyond the Homeland. Migration in the Norse world was rarely a single decision made in isolation. It was the outcome of accumulated pressures and opportunities that unfolded over years or even generations. Population growth placed strain on available farmland. Inheritance customs divided land into smaller holdings, making it difficult for younger family members to establish independent households. Environmental limits, political consolidation, and expanding trade networks all contributed to a growing awareness that opportunity might exist elsewhere. Movement outward was therefore a practical response to constraint rather than a romantic pursuit of distance. Settlement beyond Scandinavia followed recognizable patterns. Initial contact usually came through trade or seasonal travel. A small group would test conditions, establish relationships, and assess resources. If prospects were favorable, temporary camps gave way to permanent structures. Over time, these sites developed into stable communities with fields, workshops, and legal arrangements modeled on familiar practices. Settlement was incremental, not abrupt. Land selection was deliberate. Norse settlers sought areas that resembled their home environments in key ways. Access to water was essential, both for transport and sustenance. Arable land needed to support familiar crops or suitable alternatives. Forests provided timber and fuel. Where these conditions aligned, settlements succeeded more readily. Where they did not, adaptation was required, sometimes with mixed results. Once established, Norse settlements balanced continuity with adjustment. Houses resembled those at home, but materials varied according to availability. Agricultural practices were modified to suit local soils and climates. Livestock breeds were adapted. Fishing and hunting strategies shifted to reflect local species. This flexibility allowed communities to persist even when conditions differed significantly from those in Scandinavia. Social organization within settlements retained familiar structures. Households formed the basic unit of production and authority. Legal assemblies were established to manage disputes and coordinate communal decisions. These assemblies reinforced identity and continuity, ensuring that settlers remained connected to shared norms even as distance from the homeland increased. Interaction with local populations varied widely. In some regions, Norse settlers encountered sparsely populated landscapes, allowing relatively uncontested settlement. In others, they entered areas with established communities and political systems. Relationships ranged from cooperation and intermarriage to competition and conflict. Outcomes depended on local conditions, relative strength, and the ability to negotiate coexistence. Trade often facilitated peaceful interaction. Norse settlers brought goods and skills valued by local populations. In return, they acquired resources and knowledge unavailable at home. Over time, economic interdependence encouraged stability. Markets emerged where goods, language, and customs mixed. These exchanges blurred cultural boundaries without erasing them. Intermarriage played a significant role in integration. Marriages created alliances that eased tension and facilitated cooperation. Children born into these unions navigated multiple identities, often blending traditions. This blending was practical rather than ideological. Families adopted customs that worked, regardless of origin. Identity became layered rather than singular. Law adapted to these mixed environments. Norse legal traditions emphasized negotiation and restitution, which could align with local systems or require compromise. In some cases, hybrid legal practices emerged, combining elements from different traditions. These adaptations helped manage conflict in culturally diverse communities. Religion also evolved within settler societies. Traditional beliefs persisted, but exposure to local practices and Christian influence accelerated change. Religious identity often shifted more quickly in settler communities than in the homeland due to constant interaction with differing belief systems. Conversion sometimes served pragmatic purposes, easing relations and integrating settlers into broader networks. Despite adaptation, settlers maintained strong connections to their origins. Language preserved familiar structures even as vocabulary expanded. Storytelling reinforced shared history. Material culture retained recognizable forms. These continuities provided stability, particularly during periods of uncertainty. Isolation presented challenges. Settlements far from major trade routes faced supply limitations. Environmental miscalculations could lead to crop failure. Harsh climates tested resilience. Some settlements failed, abandoned when conditions proved unsustainable. These failures were part of the broader process of expansion and adaptation, offering lessons that informed future efforts. Successful settlements often became centers of further migration. As stability increased, population growth renewed pressure on resources, repeating the cycle. Movement outward continued, not as endless expansion, but as a series of localized responses to recurring conditions. For individuals, migration altered life trajectories significantly. Leaving the homeland meant separation from extended family and established support networks. Settlers relied heavily on immediate community ties. Trust and cooperation became even more essential. Leadership within settlements was tested constantly, as survival depended on collective effort. Children raised in settler communities experienced identity differently from those in the homeland. Their sense of belonging included both inherited tradition and local adaptation. They learned multiple ways of navigating social and environmental challenges. This flexibility often became an asset, allowing settlements to persist across generations. Communication with the homeland remained important. News traveled through trade routes and visiting ships. Information about political changes, environmental conditions, and economic opportunities influenced decisions on both sides. These connections prevented complete isolation and allowed cultural exchange to continue. Over time, distinctions between homeland and settlement blurred. Settler communities developed their own histories, heroes, and traditions. Loyalty shifted from place of origin to place of residence. Identity became grounded in lived experience rather than ancestry alone. Migration reshaped Norse society fundamentally. It expanded horizons, diversified experience, and tested assumptions. It demonstrated that cultural continuity did not require stasis. Adaptation could coexist with tradition. This balance allowed Norse identity to persist even as conditions changed dramatically. In the next part of the story, attention will turn to the sea again, not as a route of expansion, but as a sustained environment of work and risk, examining maritime labor, navigation, and the realities of life spent in motion between distant communities. Part 17: The Sea as Workplace, Risk, and Routine. By the later stages of the Viking Age, the sea was no longer simply a path to new lands or sudden opportunity. It had become a permanent workplace for many Norse people, integrated into economic systems, seasonal planning, and social identity. Maritime life was demanding, repetitive, and often dangerous, but it was also familiar. The sea was not approached with awe or romance. It was treated as an environment to be understood, managed, and endured. Seafaring began long before a ship left the shore. Preparation determined success more reliably than courage. Boats required constant maintenance. Hulls were inspected for gaps. Planks were resealed with tar and fiber. Oars were checked for balance and strength. Sails were examined carefully, since failure at sea could be catastrophic. These tasks were time-consuming and labor-intensive, often involving entire households or crews working together. Food preparation for voyages followed strict calculation. Space was limited. Weight mattered. Supplies had to last longer than expected because delays were common. Dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, and preserved dairy formed the core of maritime provisions. Fresh water was rationed carefully. Knowledge of spoilage, storage, and portion control was essential. Overconfidence could cost lives. Crews were small by necessity. Each person aboard a vessel had multiple responsibilities. There was little room for specialization. A sailor might row, steer, repair rigging, and assist with navigation all within a single day. This required familiarity rather than formal training. Most maritime skills were learned through participation from an early age, not instruction. Navigation relied on observation rather than instruments. Sailors read the sea through experience. Changes in wave pattern indicated approaching weather shifts. Cloud formations offered clues about wind direction and intensity. Bird behavior suggested proximity to land. Familiar routes were memorized through landmarks and repeated travel. Long-distance voyages depended on accumulated communal knowledge rather than individual insight. Life at sea was physically demanding. Rowing required sustained effort over long periods. Exposure to cold, wind, and spray was constant. Clothing was designed for insulation and flexibility rather than comfort. Wet garments were unavoidable. Illness and injury occurred frequently, with limited ability to treat them while underway. Survival depended on endurance and cooperation. Sleep was irregular. Rest came in short intervals when conditions allowed. Sailors slept where they could, often seated or leaning against the hull. Exhaustion was accepted as normal. Complaints were discouraged not through discipline, but through necessity. There was no alternative. Each person's effort mattered directly to the safety of the group. Social dynamics aboard ships were shaped by proximity and dependence. Hierarchies existed, but they were practical rather than formal. Leadership fell to those with experience and proven judgment. Decisions were often made collectively, particularly in crisis. A leader who ignored advice risked losing trust. Authority depended on competence more than status. Conflict aboard ship was dangerous and therefore minimized. Arguments were discouraged because they distracted from shared tasks. Disputes were postponed until landfall when resolution could occur without immediate risk. This enforced cooperation fostered restraint and mutual reliance. The sea also functioned as a boundary and connector simultaneously. Voyages linked distant communities, enabling trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Mariners became carriers of information as much as goods. News traveled with ships. Political developments, economic changes, and environmental conditions were shared across regions. This flow of information reduced isolation and allowed adaptation. Fishing formed a significant component of maritime labor. Coastal fishing provided reliable protein and supported local economies. Offshore fishing extended range and risk. Seasonal patterns governed fishing activity. Knowledge of spawning cycles, currents, and weather influenced success. Fishing was not opportunistic. It was planned and coordinated. Whaling and sealing occurred in some regions, requiring specialized techniques and cooperation. These activities were dangerous and unpredictable. Success yielded valuable resources, but failure could be fatal. Participation required collective agreement and preparation. These activities reinforced communal reliance and shared risk. Maritime trade expanded steadily. Norse sailors operated within established networks connecting ports and settlements. Trade required consistency. Reliable arrival mattered more than speed. Contracts were informal but enforced through reputation. A trader who failed to honor agreements risked exclusion from future exchange. This system depended on memory and communication rather than documentation. Women also participated in maritime economies, though often indirectly. They managed supply preparation, textile production for sales and clothing, and distribution of goods upon return. In coastal communities, women sometimes participated in fishing and boat maintenance. Their labor supported maritime activity even when not visible aboard ship. Children in coastal settlements were exposed to maritime life early. They learned swimming, boat handling, and navigation basics through observation and gradual involvement. This familiarity reduced fear and built competence. The sea was not treated as exceptional. It was treated as another work environment. Loss at sea was common and accepted as part of maritime life. Storms, navigational errors, and structural failure resulted in fatalities. Recovery of bodies was often impossible. Communities developed ways to acknowledge loss without physical remains. Memory, storytelling, and symbolic markers substituted for burial. Grief was present, but it was integrated into communal life rather than isolated. Risk assessment was constant. Decisions about departure considered weather, season, and urgency. Delaying a voyage was often preferable to risking unnecessary exposure. This caution contradicts portrayals of reckless seafaring. Norse mariners valued survival over bravado. The sea also imposed limits. Certain routes were navigable only during specific seasons. Ice restricted movement. Storm patterns influenced timing. These constraints shaped economic cycles and social rhythms. Maritime life followed environmental logic rather than human scheduling. As political structures strengthened, maritime activity became increasingly regulated. Kings sought control over ports, trade routes, and naval capacity. Maritime labor shifted from independent crews toward organized systems. This increased stability but reduced autonomy. The sea remained demanding, but it became part of larger administrative frameworks. Despite these changes, the fundamental experience of maritime life remained consistent. It required preparation, cooperation, endurance, and acceptance of risk. The sea rewarded knowledge rather than force. It punished error without regard for status. Understanding maritime life clarifies why Norse society functioned as it did. Mobility depended on shared effort. Communication depended on trust. Survival depended on restraint. The sea shaped attitudes toward work, authority, and uncertainty. In the next part of the story, attention will turn inward again, focusing on homecoming, reintegration, and how maritime experience influenced household life, social standing, and long-term identity within Norse communities. Part 18: Returning Home, Reputation, and the Weight of Experience. For those who spent time at sea, returning home was not a moment of dramatic arrival but a gradual reintegration into familiar patterns. Ships approached shore cautiously. Cargo was unloaded methodically. Tools were stowed. Accounts were given. Life resumed its usual rhythm, but it did not simply reset. Time away altered how individuals were perceived and how they understood themselves. Maritime experience carried weight within Norse society, shaping reputation, authority, and expectation long after a voyage ended. Homecoming began with practical obligations. Goods acquired through trade or travel were distributed according to prior agreements. Debts were settled. Compensation was paid where required. These transactions were essential to maintaining trust. A successful voyage that benefited only the traveler was viewed with suspicion. Shared gain reinforced communal bonds. Failure to distribute resources appropriately damaged reputation and could provoke dispute. Households adjusted to the return of absent members. Labor patterns shifted back to familiar arrangements. Tasks that had been redistributed during absence returned to previous holders. This adjustment required negotiation rather than assumption. Time away changed people. Skills gained at sea did not always translate directly to land-based work. Patience was required on both sides. Reputation was recalibrated during this period. Stories from the voyage circulated quickly. These stories were not performances. They were evaluated critically. Claims were weighed against evidence. Goods acquired, injuries sustained, and witnesses present all contributed to credibility. Exaggeration carried risk. Being known as unreliable undermined future opportunity. Successful travelers gained influence, but only if success was paired with restraint. Wealth alone did not guarantee respect. How that wealth was used mattered more. Individuals who reinvested resources into household stability, community projects, or reciprocal exchange strengthened their standing. Those who hoarded or displayed excess faced resentment. Experience at sea also altered perspective. Exposure to other societies introduced alternative approaches to governance, labor organization, and belief. Returning travelers often brought new ideas home, but adoption was cautious. Innovations were tested against local conditions. What worked elsewhere was not assumed to work universally. This selective adaptation preserved stability. Maritime experience influenced leadership indirectly. Individuals with travel experience often served as advisors or negotiators. Their familiarity with external systems proved valuable in trade disputes, diplomatic interactions, and strategic planning. This influence depended on demonstrated judgment rather than mere exposure. Experience alone did not confer authority. Application did. The household remained the primary unit through which experience was integrated. Knowledge gained abroad filtered into daily practice gradually. New tools were adapted. New methods were tested. Stories informed decision-making. Children listened closely, absorbing expanded understanding of the world without abandoning local identity. Women played a central role in this integration. They managed resource redistribution, evaluated practical benefit, and moderated risk. Decisions about investment, storage, and future travel often occurred within household discussion rather than public assembly. This ensured that maritime influence strengthened rather than destabilized domestic life. Extended absence could strain relationships. Marriages required renegotiation of roles and expectations. Children had grown. Elders aged. Returning individuals needed to re-establish presence within changing dynamics. This process was not always smooth. Conflict could arise, particularly if expectations differed. Resolution depended on communication and flexibility. Some individuals struggled with reintegration. The rhythm of maritime life differed from land-based routine. The intensity of shared risk and constant motion contrasted with seasonal labor cycles. Adjusting required patience. Community support mitigated this transition, but not all individuals adapted easily. This tension rarely appears in heroic narratives but was part of lived experience. Repeated travel intensified these effects. Individuals who spent long periods away often developed hybrid identities. Their sense of belonging extended beyond local boundaries. While this broadened perspective, it could also create distance. Such individuals occupied transitional positions within society, valued for their knowledge but sometimes viewed as less rooted. Homecoming also carried emotional weight. Loss at sea left gaps. Those who returned often bore memory of those who did not. These losses were acknowledged quietly. Memorialization occurred through naming, storytelling, and symbolic gesture rather than public ceremony. Grief was shared but integrated into routine. Over time, accumulated maritime experience reshaped community structure. Coastal settlements became more outward-facing. Trade networks stabilized. Knowledge circulated more efficiently. Households planned with greater awareness of external factors. This integration reduced unpredictability and increased resilience. As political authority consolidated, returning mariners encountered increased regulation. Taxes, obligations, and oversight expanded. Independent maritime activity became less common. This shift altered incentive structures. The benefits of travel were increasingly mediated through institutional channels. Individual autonomy diminished gradually. Despite these changes, the fundamental process of reintegration remained consistent. Experience mattered. Reputation endured. Homecoming required negotiation. These processes anchored Norse society amid transition. The weight of experience extended across generations. Children of travelers inherited expanded networks and opportunity. They also inherited expectation. Competence and reliability remained central values. The path carved by one generation shaped options for the next. Understanding homecoming reveals the balance Norse society maintained between movement and stability. Travel expanded possibility, but continuity depended on reintegration. The system absorbed experience without losing coherence. This capacity for integration underpinned long-term endurance. In the next part of the story, attention will turn to decline and continuity after the Viking Age, examining how Norse identity persisted within new political, religious, and economic frameworks and how everyday life carried forward even as historical labels changed. Part 19, After the Viking Age, Continuity within Change. When the Viking Age passed from living memory into history, daily life did not collapse or transform overnight. The end of an era did not feel like an ending to those who lived through it. Fields were still planted. Animals still needed care. Boats still required repair. Households continued to function, even as the larger political and religious frameworks around them shifted. What changed was not the need for work or cooperation, but the context in which these activities took place. By this stage, Norse societies were fully integrated into wider European systems. Kingship had become established rather than contested. Christianity had become institutional rather than transitional. Law increasingly relied on written records alongside spoken tradition. These developments reshaped authority, but they did not erase older practices. Instead, older structures were absorbed, reinterpreted, and constrained by new systems. Households remained central to survival and identity. While royal authority extended into taxation, military obligation, and legal enforcement, everyday life continued to revolve around family units. Decisions about labor, marriage, inheritance, and resource management were still made primarily within households. The state influenced outcomes, but it did not replace domestic authority. Land ownership became more formalized during this period. Written deeds, charters, and legal records defined boundaries more precisely than before. This reduced ambiguity but also limited flexibility. Disputes over land increasingly favored those with documentation rather than memory. This shift advantaged elites and institutions but did not eliminate local negotiation entirely. Community knowledge still mattered, especially in rural areas where written records were sparse. Agricultural practice changed gradually rather than radically. Techniques improved incrementally. New crops and tools appeared slowly through trade and innovation. Environmental constraints continued to dictate possibilities. Farming remained labor-intensive and dependent on cooperation. Seasonal rhythms persisted unchanged. The land did not respond to political transformation. Craft production also continued with continuity. Textile work, tool-making, and construction remained household-centered. Guild structures emerged later and unevenly, primarily in urban areas. Rural communities retained flexible production patterns. Skills were passed down through practice rather than formal training. Trade expanded under new conditions. Markets became more regulated. Currency use increased. Written contracts replaced some informal agreements. These changes reduced uncertainty but increased dependence on centralized authority. Merchants navigated these systems pragmatically, adapting without abandoning older habits of trust and reputation. Maritime life persisted, though its character shifted. Independent raiding had ended, but fishing, transport, and trade remained essential. Ships continued to connect communities. Coastal settlements retained outward orientation. The sea remained a source of risk and livelihood, even as oversight increased. Social identity evolved alongside these changes. People increasingly identified as subjects of a king rather than members of autonomous communities. This identity shift brought protection and obligation. Loyalty became less personal and more institutional. However, local affiliation remained strong. Kinship, neighborhood, and shared labor continued to define daily relationships. Religion became more uniform in structure but varied in practice. Christian doctrine shaped moral frameworks, legal norms, and education. Churches became centers of authority and record-keeping. Yet local customs persisted beneath official observance. Seasonal festivals retained familiar timing. Community gatherings continued. Belief was practiced rather than debated. Education expanded modestly. Literacy increased among clergy and elites. Most people remained illiterate, relying on oral communication. This division reinforced social hierarchy but did not prevent knowledge transmission. Practical knowledge continued to pass through observation and repetition. Memory of the Viking Age remained present but distant. Stories were told with increasing formality. Sagas were recorded. Ancestral figures became symbols rather than reference points. The past was used to explain origins rather than guide behavior. This shift allowed adaptation without constant comparison. Violence became more regulated. Royal courts replaced local assemblies in many matters. Punishment standardized. Feuding declined as legal enforcement strengthened. While conflict did not disappear, it became less personal and more institutional. This reduced long-term instability but also limited individual autonomy. Population distribution shifted slowly. Some rural areas declined while towns grew. Urban centers offered new opportunities in trade, craft, and administration. Migration patterns reflected economic change rather than exploration. Settlement stabilized. Despite these transformations, core values persisted. Reliability, cooperation, and contribution remained central to reputation. Social standing still depended on behavior over time rather than abstract status alone. These values linked past and present. Generational transition played a key role. Those born after the Viking Age accepted new systems as normal. For them, kingship and Christianity were not innovations but inherited structures. This acceptance reduced tension and allowed society to move forward. Older generations adapted as well. Change was negotiated rather than resisted outright. Familiar practices were retained where possible. Where adaptation was necessary, it was approached cautiously. This gradualism prevented collapse and allowed continuity. The Norse world did not disappear. It transformed into medieval Scandinavian societies that retained distinct language, law, and culture. These societies contributed to broader European development while preserving local identity. Understanding this period challenges the idea that history moves through abrupt endings. The Viking Age ended as a category, not as lived experience. Its people continued, carrying forward habits shaped by earlier conditions. This continuity explains why Norse influence persists in language, legal concepts, and cultural memory. The transition preserved functionality while altering form. Change occurred without erasure. In the final part of the story, attention will turn to reflection. The focus will be on what the Norse experience reveals about adaptation, resilience, and the ways societies respond to constraint and opportunity across time. Part 20: What the Norse experience reveals. Looking back across the full span of the Norse world, from early settlement through expansion, transformation, and continuity, what emerges most clearly is not a story of conquest or collapse, but one of sustained adaptation. The Norse experience shows how societies respond to constraint, opportunity, and uncertainty through practical adjustment rather than ideology. Their history is not defined by a single trait, but by a pattern of decision-making grounded in survival, cooperation, and long-term thinking. The Norse did not begin as seafarers driven by ambition alone. Their movement outward arose from specific conditions. Limited arable land, inheritance practices that divided property, and environmental pressures created circumstances where staying put was not always viable. Rather than viewing these limits as defeat, Norse communities treated them as problems to be solved. Travel, trade, and settlement were responses to necessity, not expressions of identity. This distinction matters because it reframes expansion as practical rather than aggressive by default. At every stage, Norse society demonstrated flexibility. Social roles were structured but not rigid. Authority existed, but it required constant negotiation. Law emphasized participation and restitution rather than punishment. Belief systems allowed for coexistence and transition. Even when new religious frameworks arrived, they were absorbed gradually, shaped by existing customs rather than imposed uniformly. This capacity to incorporate change without losing coherence was central to long-term survival. The household remained the core unit throughout these changes. Political systems expanded. Religious institutions formalized. Trade networks grew more complex. Yet daily life continued to revolve around shared labor, resource management, and cooperation within families. This stability at the smallest scale allowed adaptation at larger scales. When systems above the household shifted, the household absorbed the impact, maintaining continuity. Work anchored identity more strongly than ideology. A person's value was measured by reliability, contribution, and judgment rather than abstract belief or inherited status. This emphasis created resilience. Individuals adapted roles as conditions required. Communities redistributed labor during hardship. Knowledge passed through practice rather than doctrine. These mechanisms allowed survival in environments that offered little margin for error. The Norse relationship with law illustrates this pragmatism clearly. law was not distant authority but communal process. Assemblies relied on memory, testimony, and reputation. Even as written law emerged, participation remained important. The goal was not moral perfection but functional balance. Conflict was expected. The challenge lay in containing it. Legal systems succeeded when they preserved relationships rather than asserting dominance. Violence existed, but it was regulated. It carried consequence. It was not celebrated as an end in itself. Even raiding, often emphasized in popular narratives, functioned within limits shaped by season, opportunity, and political context. When those conditions changed, raiding lost relevance. Norse societies did not cling to outdated practices out of identity. They moved on. Migration and settlement demonstrate another dimension of adaptation. Norse settlers did not replicate their homeland rigidly. They modified practices to suit new environments. Where conditions allowed, settlements flourished. Where they did not, failure occurred and lessons were learned. Identity persisted through shared norms and memory rather than uniform practice. This flexibility allowed Norse culture to persist across distance and difference. The sea, often portrayed as a symbol of adventure, was treated primarily as a workplace. Maritime life demanded preparation, cooperation, and restraint. Success depended on knowledge and patience rather than daring. This approach shaped attitudes toward risk and authority that extended beyond seafaring into broader social life. The sea reinforced values already present on land. Homecoming and reintegration reveal the importance of balance between movement and stability. Experience gained elsewhere mattered, but it had to be integrated responsibly. Reputation depended not on what one had seen, but on how one applied that knowledge within community. This emphasis prevented fragmentation. Mobility expanded possibility without undermining cohesion. The transition after the Viking Age reinforces the same pattern. Change occurred gradually. Kingship centralized authority. Christianity reshaped belief. Written law formalized structure. Yet older practices persisted beneath new frameworks. The Norse world did not vanish. It transformed into medieval Scandinavian societies that retained distinct character while integrating into broader systems. This continuity challenges narratives that frame history as a series of abrupt endings. Memory of the Viking Age itself illustrates how societies construct meaning. Later generations reshaped the past to suit present needs, emphasizing heroism, violence, or exploration depending on context. These memories reveal as much about those who remembered as those who lived. Understanding this process underscores the importance of distinguishing lived reality from later interpretation. What the Norse experience ultimately reveals is the importance of adaptability rooted in practice rather than ideology. They did not pursue expansion for its own sake. They did not resist change for the sake of tradition. They responded to conditions as they arose, using familiar tools, social structures, and values to navigate uncertainty. This approach allowed them to endure across centuries of transformation. The Norse story also highlights the limits of simplistic historical labels. Viking describes a set of activities within a specific context, not a fixed identity. Most Norse people were farmers, craftspeople, traders, and household managers. Their lives were shaped by routine more than spectacle. Recognizing this complexity provides a more accurate understanding of the past. Resilience, in this context, does not mean resistance to change. It means capacity to absorb change without collapse. Norse society demonstrated this repeatedly. When land became scarce, they traveled. When raiding became impractical, they traded. When belief systems shifted, they adapted. When authority centralized, they negotiated. Each adjustment preserved function while altering form. The relevance of this experience extends beyond historical interest. It offers insight into how societies can navigate transition without losing cohesion. It emphasizes the value of local stability alongside broader integration. It highlights the importance of practical decision-making grounded in lived experience rather than abstract ideals. As this long account comes to a close, the Norse world does not end. It continues in altered form, carried forward through language, law, culture, and memory. The people who lived through these centuries did not see themselves as part of an age. They saw themselves as managing land, raising families, resolving disputes, and preparing for the next season. That perspective, grounded in everyday necessity, is perhaps the most important legacy of all. The story rests here not because it is finished, but because it has reached a point of understanding. The Norse experience, examined in full, offers a record of continuity within change, and of a society shaped less by legend than by steady, practical engagement with the world around it. As the long path of this story grows quiet, there is no sharp ending waiting for us. The Norse world does not close like a book. It slows. It settles. It becomes part of the ground beneath everything that followed. The people we have walked beside do not vanish when the Viking Age fades from view. They return to their fields, their homes, their harbors. They raise children who know a different world than their parents did. They adapt without ceremony, because adaptation has always been part of life. Kings rule where assemblies once held greater power. Churches rise where old rituals once took place. Trade replaces raiding. Writing replaces memory. And still, much remains familiar. Fires are lit at dusk. Tools are repaired. Food is prepared carefully. The seasons turn as they always have. If there is something to carry with you from this story, it is not an image of conquest or drama. It is the quieter understanding that most of history is lived in repetition. In work done steadily. In decisions made carefully. In lives shaped by responsibility rather than spectacle. The Norse endured not because they were exceptional, but because they were attentive. They watched the land. They listened to one another. They adjusted when adjustment was required. Their story reminds us that change does not always announce itself. It often arrives gradually, through small shifts that accumulate over time. And yet, continuity persists. Language carries traces of old ways. Customs survive in altered form. Memory remains, even when its meaning evolves. Now, as this telling comes to rest, there is nothing left to resolve. The past does not ask for judgment. It simply asks to be understood on its own terms. And having been understood, it can be allowed to drift gently into the background, where it belongs. If your eyes are heavy, you can let them close. If your thoughts are slowing, you can let them wander without direction. The work of listening is done. The story no longer needs attention. The world continues quietly, as it always has. Thank you for spending this time here, for walking patiently through centuries of ordinary lives and gradual change. You do not need to remember every detail. What matters has already settled where it needs to. Background historian out.